Generosity New York is a group of Christians spurring on one another to experience philanthropy differently, with more joy, more wisdom, and doing it in community, which is rare. We deliver events, content, and counsel. Events that are inspirational, educational, and safe. Not meant for solicitation. This is meant for learning and being inspired around your own generosity.
Whole idea that we have to be socially isolated. Now, if you think about something like 9/11, after 9/11 happened, we were all able to gather and discuss it and talk about it and share. In the current situation, we're actually being forced to do the opposite. Now, fortunately, we have some technology like we're using now that allows us to do that, but really, we're being told to stay away from each other, which just magnifies a lot of the emotions that are coming out of this and the mental distress. There are a couple of groups that have particular issues and are at much higher vulnerability. So if you have a pre-existing mental health condition, this is only going to make it worse, and particularly with substance abuse. We're going to talk about that. Older people who are at a higher risk from COVID-19, or even people who have had COVID-19 and survived, they are at a much higher mental health risk. Children and teens, they don't really understand what's going on, and so that's a challenge. And then obviously our doctors, nurses, and first responders who are on the front line. One reason that it's significant with folks who have substance abuse is that they already have compromised lungs and respiration. And as we know from reading all the news, COVID-19 particularly impacts people with compromised lungs and respiration. So these folks kind of start off in the back to begin with, and then you add on top of that typically folks suffering with substance use disorder have decreased access to healthcare anyway, housing insecurity, and with the different disruptions now, they may be cut off from medications, counseling, and the other support systems that they've seen before. So we see about a triple the increase of the impact of COVID-19 if you have a respiratory issue. So what can we expect during the crisis? Well, clearly there's going to be an increased use of addictive substances. I've read different statistics showing 100% increase in alcohol sales, for example, and in different areas. And so, we can expect that a lot of people will try to combat this stress by using addictive substances. We're going to have more overdoses because of that, more mental health related calls, Baker Act calls. The PTSD is caused by traumatic situations. Well, we're seeing a lot of those traumatic situations, obviously, due to this, and then more suicides. And just, I pulled a quote here from Florida in one of our local counties. They've already seen an uptick in suicide attempts and calls, an overall increase in mental health type calls. And by the way, this was a couple weeks ago, so it's only gotten worse since then. So after the crisis is over, so, I know obviously we have to focus on what's happening now, the physical impact and the mental impact, but we can expect that there will be lingering impacts from this afterwards, even, once the wave passes for the physical illness. And so, you're going to see people with depression and anxiety disorders, PTSD, and this is a major issue that we need to look out for with our healthcare professionals and first responders. So this study showed 30% of the folks had PTSD and depression post the SARS epidemic. So, and again, more overdoses, more suicides. So what do we do about it? You should anticipate that we are going to have a substantial increase in mental health needs now and post-crisis. So we need to, as a society, prepare for that. It's great, Greg is doing what he's doing. Others on the call that are going to be speaking have been helping in this area, but we need to prepare for that, fund it, get the people in place for that. There are multiple conditions are going to occur, what's called co-occurring conditions, where you have addiction combined with PTSD or with anxiety or depression. We're going to have to triage folks, and the best way to do this will be online. And so I'm working on a project called Project Opioid here in Central Florida, we're working on an online assessment that people can take to gauge what their mental health is. And then we'll be able to place them in the correct spot for their needs. We're going to really have to leverage technology now. There's no way we're going to do this with the existing bricks and mortar systems that we have. We've seen obviously the huge increase in telebehavioral health, telemedicine, teleprescribing. That has got to continue afterwards if we're going to meet the needs of the folks, and then use metrics to evaluate and improve outcomes. I'd highlight to you this McKinsey article, Returning to Resilience. It's an excellent article on if you really want to get a handle of what's happening now, what's going to happen in the future, and how we can help. So a couple of things for employers to think about, and not just employers. This first point, focus on your own mental health. You can't lead if you are out of action, okay? And, you know, as a leader, there's a term called emotional contagion. So you actually set the emotions of your team. And it's very important that you are controlling your emotions and you're taking care of your own mental health, because that's going to impact the people that you lead. And I'm going to give you some specific ideas to help with that. But, you know, recognize that when your employees come back to work, if they're not currently working for you, or even if they're working for you today, their productivity is going to suffer, okay? People are going to be focused elsewhere, and that stress is going to be impacting them. So just factor that into what you're doing. And then, you know, look at your programs, make sure that you can provide your employees with the quality care that they need for their mental health. I'm not going to go through all of these. Again, this is going to be in the presentation we're going to send you afterwards, but there are a number of things you can do to help yourself in the current environment, help you and your family members to cope much better. And I put together this list from a number of different articles. Hopefully it'll be helpful to you. But as I say, the most important message here is take care of your own mental health in this situation so that you can take care of those around you. So I know I went through that fairly quickly, but as I say, I wanted to leave plenty of time for Q&A, and we can certainly do that afterwards. In the appendix here, there's some ways to get additional help and resources if you need them. But once again, you know, we need to be prepared for this. We need to be thinking about this, planning for it, just as we've been doing on the physical side. The mental side is just as important, and we need to anticipate that and make sure that we're ready to take care of it. So with that, Greg, I'll give it back to you for the other speakers and then the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brad. Before I bring on Jan and John, I just had a question for you regarding for some of us on the call that you know, aren't in the space professionally. What does generosity look like in the mental health space? How can we support others in a kind, respectful way?
Well, I would say at a couple different levels. So the first is, you know, as you see people in need from a mental health standpoint, share some of these ideas and embrace them. In particular, you know, this whole idea of isolation. We need to make connections with folks, even though we're socially distant. So if you have people who you know, they may be elderly or they may be isolated in some way, reach out to them, okay? Call them, email them, do a Zoom call, FaceTime, whatever with them, but help people who are isolated. And then, as I say, share some of these ideas. Certainly, you know, getting engaged with local mental health facilities is very important. And so either from a financial standpoint, a volunteering standpoint, there are loads of organizations out there that are fabulous organizations. You know, my company does a lot with, for example, Wounded Warrior Project, and they have a massive mental health program for our veterans. And so, you know, that's an outstanding organization if you want to get involved with them. But yeah, I would look at those different opportunities and remember that this is critically important. Let me just give you a quick statistic, because again, I'm very focused on the addiction side. There are 100 babies born every day with neonatal abstinence syndrome. That means they're born addicted. 100. Every 15 minutes, a child is born in the U.S. with neonatal abstinence syndrome. Okay, and you think about the societal impact that that has, because all those kids, their futures and everything else. So, you know, that's something to get engaged with as well, and helping to prevent that from happening. A lot of these mothers, you know, don't have support systems. They're addicted, and then their children are born addicted, and we need to stop that. So that's just one example. Great question, though. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. And you know, your message was very timely pre-pandemic. It's extremely timely currently. So our next guest speaker is Jan Brown. She's the founder and executive director of Spirit Works Foundation, and it's a recovery community organization with locations. Brown is an ordained deacon in the Episcopal Church, presently serving at Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg, Virginia. She graduated from the College of William and Mary with a BA in psychology, is certified as a peer recovery support specialist, a recovery coach professional, and an international scholar on addiction studies. Jan received her Master of Science degree in addiction studies in 2018 through a specialized program with King's College in London, the University of Adelaide, and Virginia Commonwealth University. She's an addictions educator and speaker on topics of recovery-oriented systems of care, faith responders, the role of the church in addiction and recovery, recovery support services, and recovery management. She also serves as the chairperson of the board of directors of Faces and Voices of Recovery, recovery consultant on SAMHSA State's Targeted Responses, Technical Assistance Center team, consensus panel member for the SAMHSA TIP, peer recovery support specialist and co-chair of the Addictions and Recovery Commission, the Diocese of Southern Virginia. And in 2014, she was appointed by the governor of Virginia to serve on the governor's task force on prescription drug and heroin abuse. You must be very busy, Jan. And I will turn it over to you to present.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. What Greg didn't say, because it wasn't included in my bio, is that I'm also a woman in long-term recovery from addiction, which for me means I haven't used drugs or alcohol for the past 33 years. And so much of my work has grown out of my own personal journey. The past 15 years, however, my work has really changed to be able to use the science to be able to support individuals and families and communities in this struggle. I founded Spirit Works Foundation 15 years ago. At the time, I was working with healthcare professionals. These were physicians, veterinarians, nurses, and others who themselves had addiction. And so that was my original entry into the professional world of recovery and recovery support. And one of the things we created this physical building and subsequent programs because one too many relapsed. So in particular, this was a dentist who left after being in a 90-day program, and within 4 hours, his wife called cursing and screaming because he had gotten a DUI and was arrested. And her disappointment in the treatment center that he had left, clearly, according to her, we had failed him. And what was missing was kind of that next step, that continuation beyond treatment. And so that was the impetus for me starting Spirit Works, which the idea being it was a place that we would kind of catch people as they were transitioning into the community. From there, we started working with jails and prisons. We started working with the community-based health system, and have really lots of word of mouth and people coming off the street. Always, I had a vision towards kind of the whole approach, if you will, towards recovery, which includes children and families, particularly parents at this juncture where we are today. And so, Brad, who spoke before me, kind of laid out all of the science, and I think for me, just being able to speak practically to what he shared with you all in terms of what we are seeing on the ground. one of the highlights, I think, for me that happened early on in this pandemic is we had a young gentleman that we had been working with. I've known him since he was a little boy. He attended our, we have a children's summer camp. These are for children whose parents are addicted. And so he had attended summer camp many, many years ago, and was now a young man, 24 years old, in recovery, and was living in one of the recovery residences in Richmond, Virginia. Immediately, he lost his job as the resident manager and was told that he had 2 weeks to get out of his house. And as a result of that, he became desperate, felt like he had everything that he had was lost, and he ended up returning to use and overdosing and dying. And sadly, that's not an uncommon story. It was devastating for the community. It was devastating for his family, particularly now, since there's really not an option to properly bury him and to be with his family and be able to minister to the larger recovery community. And so as a result of that, we're seeing even more folks return to use. One of the pieces that's really difficult is, many of the young people are working in jobs like construction and in the retail service industry, and those are the jobs that went first. And so, that was a huge impetus to even further isolate many of them. And so then with the loss of many of these recovery residences, the people aren't on leases. People in early recovery have damaged credit, damaged relationships with their families. And so Virginia is not protecting their eviction status because they are not legal residents. They're considered home. If you're living in a sober residence, you're still considered homeless. These are folks who live week to week, paycheck to paycheck, and so a tremendous amount of struggle for them. One of the things that we know about overdose and death by suicide is that these are called deaths of despair. People feel as though they have no other way out, no other choice, and so they end up in some regards taking their own lives, but certainly giving up. Families, what we're seeing with families is, their loved ones being in treatment and them, having made the decision not to let them back into their homes, unsure of what to do as people are leaving. And so we're watching parents take children home too soon, taking children home. These are primarily adult children, taking children home that they would not otherwise have in their homes because of their addiction and the related issues that come along with it. And so the amount of stress that families are feeling is exceptional. One of the things that we are starting to do is to create a CARES line for family members to be able to call. And on the other end of that phone would be another family member. It could be a grandparent, it could be a mom or a dad, it could be a sibling, because siblings are often left out in this particular illness. It could be a mom or dad whose child has died, because we are seeing grief intensified, and I don't know that we talk enough about grief. And so we've talked about attempting to start a grief group, because it is a continual grief process, one that doesn't get to finish up during this period of time. Hopefully when John talks, he can talk a bit about the relationship that we've got with them, and the godsend that having that relationship before pandemic started meant that we have been pretty uniquely qualified to be able to address many of the family issues. Brad also mentioned the connection and isolation. It's somewhat unique in the recovery community, And that is the case because, you know, there's mutual support groups. Many of you may be familiar with 12-step meetings. There's certainly other recovery pathways as well. With your 12-step recovery meetings, there's what's called the meeting before the meeting, and then the meeting after the meeting. And this is a time when people gather and really build that sense of community. And Zoom is wonderful, but we don't have the meeting before the meeting and the meeting after the meeting in the same way. And so that isolation deepens. The sense of physical touch is also something that's really important in the recovery community. And so I think initially many meetings, many individuals struggled for that first month because it was almost like shock. I can't go to these Zoom meetings. And there were questions for many about the role of anonymity and how that worked. And many didn't even have any idea how to use this type of technology. And you know, our Warrenton Center are living very rurally. And so, you know, it makes it even more difficult because they don't even have access often to the internet. A sad story in Warrenton that happened earlier this week was one of our young men who had gotten out of jail. We have a jail program. And so these are men and women who are participating in recovery services while they're in jail. And this one young man got out, went to live with his mother, which was a very dysfunctional and dangerous household setting. Subsequently, he returned to use, and you know, his mom is hoping that he get arrested because she doesn't want him out on the streets. Very concerned about him, you know, getting the illness, even more concerned about him returning to use and dying. One of the things that we know is that, you know, the people who are at the greatest risk are those who are leaving treatment centers and or jails. And they're at risk because they have had a period of abstinence. And many of them, when they leave, if they do return to use, they do so at the same rates as before, and that's what causes their death. And so we're, you know, it's a delicate situation as treatment centers and jails are trying to figure out what to do. They certainly don't want the disease in their respective facilities. At the same time, you know, we want to make sure that their transitions are safe into the community and that they have the necessary supports in order to be successful in their recovery. So I will stop. And of course, when and if you all have questions, I'm certainly happy to answer them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jan, for sharing those stories, especially your personal story. I personally have been very touched by addiction in my family. I have family members that have suffered. I lost one of my best friends from high school at the age of 35 from addiction. I've tried, trying to help some family members, I developed a understanding that I didn't have. I thought I knew much more than I knew, and it's a truly devastating illness. You know, the recidivism rate is mind-blowing. I think it's what, 3 to 4% only achieve lasting recovery. It's a huge problem out there, and until your life really gets impacted by it, it's something that doesn't always just cross our radar screen. And we, many of us are, like I used to be, very underinformed or misinformed, or have ideas around addiction that may not align with reality. So thanks so much for sharing that. Okay, I'd like to introduce John Temple, who is the CEO and president of Guideposts, which is a spiritual nonprofit organization that encourages wellness through inspirational content creation. I got to say, just checking out your site, John, very inspirational how you, that message of hope and anything's possible through hope, prayer, and faith. I think that's just phenomenal to be getting. People need to hear that these days. John served as the first ever chief of the human trafficking unit at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in New York City. He worked to form the unit in recognition of the devastating impact that human trafficking has on its victims and their families. Under his leadership, the unit developed innovative approaches to combat trafficking on a domestic and international scale. His holistic vision brought together diverse stakeholders to build the anti-trafficking community across multiple disciplines, geographies, and industry. So John, the floor is yours. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thanks very much, Greg. And thanks to Brad and Jan for really bringing all of this into the fore and really identifying what we're all sort of experiencing right now. One of the things that kind of struck me as I was listening to Brad and Jan really is this idea that we are thinking about COVID-19 and the susceptibility of people to COVID-19. We often talk about pre-existing conditions, and we think about those pre-existing conditions as maybe lung problems or other kind of physical ailments. But as you look through that list, anxiety, sadness, depression, helplessness, isolation, those are pre-existing conditions. Those are conditions that were occurring before the pandemic, and they're exacerbated. They're vulnerabilities that the virus is now exploiting today. And so I think we need to think about them in those terms. And so as we think about, okay, how do you combat those, right? We have our frontline medical staff who are working tirelessly and a great personal sacrifice to be able to focus on those pre-existing conditions. But how do we then, as a community of, again, Guideposts as an organization isn't there to provide that sort of direct service, but how can we as an organization combat those things? And we do those things, and we combat those pre-existing conditions with hope, with faith, and with prayer. Because we believe that against those three things, anxiety, sadness, depression, those things cannot stand. And so for 75 years, Guidepost has really used the power of shared experiences, used the power of storytelling to be able to connect things, that all things are possible through God. And if you have hope and faith and you're prayerful, you can get through absolutely anything, because we believe that our God is bigger than COVID-19. We believe that it's bigger than anxiety. We believe that it's bigger than addiction. We believe that it's bigger than isolation, because our message ultimately is that you are not alone. You're never alone. We're here to support you. We're here to pray with you. We're here to walk by you, walk beside you. And what Jan said is absolutely heartbreaking. When she describes an overdose death as a death of despair, imagine the isolation. Imagine the before that happens, before you inject that needle, before you go through with what is ultimately a suicide, how isolated and despondent you must feel. And wouldn't it be a better world if we could combat that together with hope, faith, and prayer? And so, I'm really excited to talk a little bit about our partnership with SpiritWorks, which is a great organization, as you heard Jan talking about. But really, as we as an organization have thought about what can we do as an organization to insert our faith-affirming messages of hope, faith, and prayer into areas where they really need it. Addiction obviously was one of those places, and so Guideposts as an organization actually has been part of working in the addiction recovery space really since its founding. In 1947, Guideposts and through the friendship of Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, our founder, with Bill W., Bill Wilson, the founder of the 12-Step movement. Bill Wilson gave one of the first interviews to Guideposts, and did so, I believe, because Guideposts is a non-judgmental, faith-affirming place. And, at a time where you say, hi, I'm John T. and I'm an alcoholic, and you were really shunned, and that stigma continues today. And so we need that non-judgmental voice where, irrespective of where you are on your faith journey, irrespective of where you are on life's journey, God doesn't give up on you. We don't give up on you. And that's the message that people need today. So as we thought about how we could really connect that idea, that concept, and connect it to actual service, to make it actionable, to make it so that we can actually judge the efficacy of it, in partnership with a number of groups, developed a program called Resolve to Quit, R2Q. and we'll send around links later, but Resolve to Quit was really a labor of love. It was a group of people within the Guidepost organization who came together and said, okay, what can we do that's most actionable? And nearly every single person in that room, when we started, it was about 11 people, looked around, and we learned so much. And people said, I'm an addict. Never shared that before with anyone. Others said, I lost my brother to addiction, and everyone was touched by some personal story. And that was borne out again through survey work that we did, where of the 7 million people Guidepost reaches as an organization, 60% of them said that either they personally or a direct loved one had been touched by this disease. And so we knew that there was really a connection that we needed to do something with. And so what we embarked to do was to partner with organizations that are doing direct service. Again, we're storytellers. We're people who are out to share the power of hope, faith, and prayer, and teach through storytelling. And so we knew that we needed to be able to build a few things. One was to be able to build digital community that could scale. Two, we needed to be able to drive it through proven content that we could prove actually that is actually changing people's behavior and connecting them, making them more hopeful. And three, we knew there was a whole lot of things that we don't know. We're not counselors. We're not people who, we're not doing what Jan's doing. We're not doing what Brad's doing. But how do we augment their service? How do we expand their reach? How do we help to fill those gaps between meetings? We talked about, Jan talked a little bit about the meeting before the meeting and the meeting after the meeting. Well, how do you recreate that digitally? And so what we created was a platform where it really created a circle of support, where you had groups who could come together in a closed community, where there was check-ins. So every day, were you doing things that are healthy for you? Are you doing things, are you feeling triggered? If you have a crisis, here's a button. It's going to alert your whole circle so that they can rally around. Built in, actually, Zoom functionality is used to power meetings and one-on-one sessions. And so if you need to connect to your coach, if you need to connect to your sponsor, if you're a family member, a parent group, like the pilot we're doing with Spirit Works, how do they stay connected in a community when they're not able to be physically together, those in-between times? And so we could never have predicted that this was about to happen, but what has since happened is that the need for this has become so much greater because of that isolation, because of that missing touch, because of the meeting before the meeting and after the meeting not happening. This is a technical way to be able to do that. And then to be able to power it through faith-affirming, hopeful, positive content that tells people that, this is, we're going to get through this, that we're going to be able to make it, that combats anxiety, sadness, depression, and helplessness. And so I'll wrap up to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. But again, just to say, I'm very thankful to be here, our partnership with Spirit Works and the good work that they do. And I think that really together, we can, by sharing our stories, really make a difference in ways that perhaps we don't think about. And as Brad was talking about, ensuring that we're reaching out to people, the concept of sharing, okay, what are you going through? Because people connect to stories. Jesus taught through storytelling. And so, telling your story, whether it's in the rooms or in other places, is a critical component to being able to connect with one another in both that spiritual way that's really tremendously healing. So I will hit my mute button now and turn it back over to you. Thanks, Gray.
Yeah, John, thanks for that hopeful message and your mission. I don't think there's enough, we can never get enough hope out there, especially during these times, and hope placed in, fruitful paths. I have a question for Jan and John and Brad too, whoever wants to take a stab at it. But with addiction touching so many lives, and the stats obviously change, opiates, the opioid epidemic certainly probably propelled addiction forward. You have the substance addictions, you have the behavioral addictions, the sex, the gambling, the food. I mean, if you had to take a stab at it, I think I heard once that one stat when it came just to alcoholism, that about 9% of our country, the adult population, was could be considered alcoholic. You could just go. Another one I heard is just go down your street. Every 3 homes, there's at least one alcoholic living there. And that's just alcohol. When it comes to just addiction in general, what percentage of our population do you think we are talking about these days?
The most recent statistics that I've seen are about 12 to 13%. Which is pretty high. I would also like to offer what is often forgotten about is that 1 in 4 children are growing up under 18 are growing up in a household with addiction, which is equally staggering.
Yeah, and thanks for pointing that out, because it, as we know, it's truly a family illness. It affects not just the addict. It can be devastating for the whole family, trying to support and love and seeing some of the wreckage that can come from that. When it comes to recovery in this space, do you guys see any hopeful solutions? I've heard, I have a dear friend who's used to be a director of an aftercare facility that was explaining to me about brain scans. Part of the challenge, to my understanding, when it comes to addiction is, the whole denial thing, right? And it's very hard for people to accept the fact that they are suffering from addiction or alcoholism or whatever it is. And, there are now brain scans that can actually show the deterioration of the prefrontal cortex, and the midbrain starts, the midbrain behaviors start getting kicked in, the primal behaviors, the hunger, the sex, all this kind of stuff. And it seems to me like there's already, these scans that can be done to kind of show more conclusively, hey, you can believe it or not, but you suffer from addiction. Is that I don't see enough of that out there. I don't know how real that is. I know that came out of Utah, but can you speak to more? Are there any encouraging developments in the recovery space, addiction, that can help people really accept the disease as we would refer to it, the illness?
Greg, I'd like to just put, I'd just like to put a major plug in for medication-assisted treatment. Medication-assisted treatment for particularly opioid use disorder increases the survival rate by 50 to 80%. 50 to 80%. So think about that for a minute. If there was a drug that would increase your cancer survival rate by like 10%, everybody would want it, right? And so, for addiction, particularly, again, opioid use disorder, buprenorphine is I would submit, the drug of choice today for that. It removes the cravings, the withdrawals, and some really amazing things now. A lot of people, they have daily buprenorphine, but now they have these implants and injections. So you go there's one called Sublocade. It's a 1-month injection. So you get it once a month. There's an implant called Probufene that lasts for 6 months. Okay, 6 months of continuous delivery of buprenorphine. And they're having phenomenal success with this. And when you combine that with behavioral health care, it really has a huge impact on relapse rates. It provides chemical sobriety and emotional sobriety. And that, I would submit, is really the answer for the opioid epidemic right now. Barriers to that, it's expensive, okay? It's very difficult sometimes to get insurance coverage for it. But, I've talked to, and I'm sure Jan is, always talking to leading addiction experts and everything in the field. And that seems to be the best approach these days.
Okay.
The other barrier, and I certainly agree, the other barrier with that is what we combat in the community, which is attitudes. There's still, among many in recovery, certainly family members in society, that abstinence is the only way to go. And so we see, people who are taking medication as prescribed, being shunned from meetings and being told that you're not allowed to talk because you're still using. And so I think that's got to be one of the things that changes sooner than later, because, when I first started working really with people with opioid use disorder, they would live about 2 years. Now we're 16, 17 months tops. And so that trend continues to go down, and in large part because, the wave of the epidemic that we've got right now has moved from, prescription medication to heroin on the street. And now we've got fentanyl. And even in some places, we've got carfentanil, which is tranquilizer for large game animals. And that's being mixed in the drug supply. And when that's you don't stand a chance at life if you're taking something that an elephant or a tiger would be tranquilized with. I wanted to go back to your question real quickly. We have populations for whom recovery is the expectation, and these are physicians, college students, your fighter pilots, airline pilots, and they are monitored. They're monitored for up to a period of 5 years, and they're monitored with this being a health condition, not punitively. And so their rates are upwards of 85 to 95% of people maintaining long-term recovery, being able to return to their jobs, and those kinds of things. And so one of the things that we've got to do is value human life, whether you're a physician or whatever, in the same way, so that the majority of folks can have access to the ongoing care. The other piece with that is kind of at the very beginning of one's recovery journey. We're able to tell the folks that, this gets better, right? It gets better. The next part of though is not yet. So those first 6 months, people are starting to feel better. They're starting to think better. They're starting to develop that sense of hope. And about that same time, brain chemistry around that 6 to 9 month period, their brain chemistry begins to allow them to know the things that they loved and lost, the damages that they've done. And so that period is a critical time period, according to the research. John Kelly out of Harvard, we've got a beautiful graph that goes like that. But then when you pull out the graph, you can see that 6 to 9 month period is where we really have to target support for those individuals, because that's the period of time that is most challenging, and why so few people make it to that 1 year mark of recovery.
Yeah, I've always been curious about the recovery thresholds that are key. I've heard 5 years, a big one statistically. Once they made it to 5 years, the risk of recidivism goes down dramatically. But it's 6 to 9 months also. That's another hurdle. Once you get through that, that's their rate of long-term recovery goes way up.
Yes.
Yeah. One question that came out there: eHome or telehealth can address the need for the peer-to-peer community during this crisis. We wanted to expand on that a little bit. Specifically, what are you guys doing or seeing that really works right now to address the need for the peer-to-peer during this quarantine season?
Well, a couple of things. So number one, it's critically important that you have human interaction. There are apps that are out there and things like that, and the artificial intelligence apps. And what we found is you need to combine the technology with the human interaction. And the quality of your counselor is incredibly important. So, one of the things I would tell people, if you're looking, make sure you get a high quality counselor, because the better counselor you have, the greater therapeutic alliance, which means the trust that you develop. And once again, numerous studies have shown the stronger the therapeutic alliance, the better the outcomes in a shorter period of time. Group therapy is also very helpful, particularly for addiction. And, Jan and John have talked about that, that's very important. But I think, combination of individual counseling, education, which is huge, family counseling, and, we really encourage everyone addiction is a family disease. It can either be caused by a dysfunctional family or even in a functional family. You have to know what to do in helping the person who has an addiction disorder. So, that's a critical component. Assessments to really understand what's going on with the person's mental health. So it's a combination of things together that will help to solve this and to basically bring the person back to healing and wholeness.
All right. Thank you, Brad. Another question that I have is around, the spiritual versus the mental, the chemical component. Can you guys talk about that component? I've seen, you have these discussions, or I've had these discussions, how much is really chemical based, right? I've experienced a mental illness with family members as well. But some of where I've personally witnessed the most transformational change has really been on the spiritual side. I have a stepdaughter who really struggled for a couple of years with some emotional challenges. And it was about a few months ago, she ended up going to a retreat for teenagers, and she just came back on fire. Something, whether it was the spiritual that helped, affected the chemical positively, or vice versa, there was definitely a shift. And I think that can get very overlooked, especially in a secular-based therapy. But could one of you speak to that a little bit in your experience, the spiritual versus the chemical and how they intermix? I know it's not an easy one, so don't expect it.
I'm happy to take it. I just don't want to monopolize. It's critical with any disease recovery process. I mean, we see that those who have either a practice of faith or spirituality, I think Brad mentioned yoga, meditation, some of mindfulness and those kinds of things, that connection of reaching out to something greater than ourselves is vital. And, those are, I'm going to say we are the people who, when that is a part of our lived experience, we talk about God can do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And that's kind of the bottom line. And, we come across, certainly in my work in the community, lots of folks who struggle, and they talk about, the God thing, and that I just can't accept, the spirituality of this illness. And I do a talk called There Are No Atheists in Foxholes. And that really, allows people to take a look at, when you're facing bullets and danger, we all reach out to something. And so even if we can just start there and allow that to grow, it will continue to grow. I think what's been difficult is the brain scan studies and that kind of thing, that everyone doesn't have access to them. But certainly there are measures of quality of life, of, increased hope. We can now see those things on scans, which is wonderful. And so we've kind of backed into it by, being able to move backwards for many people. In the therapy world, they talk about trans-theoretical and those kinds of that kind of terminology to really begin to address the area of spirituality.
Well, thank you. I think we have time for one other question. We're pushing up on 9 o'clock, and just throw it out there to the group. What advice can you give us right now as far as supporting not just our own mental health, but what's a real proactive step that we can all think to do, a takeaway for loved ones that we maybe suspect are struggling? Friendship, family. What's a really good first step in confronting someone or addressing a problem in the addiction space or mental health space? If could be someone suffering from severe depression that we want to reach out to, but we don't quite know exactly how to make that first step. You want to take that on? Thanks, John.
Well, this is definitely not my area of expertise, so I'm going to turn that to Janet and Brad. But what I would say about it is, underneath the underlying assumption in that question is that we've recognized it and that we're approaching it without stigma. And I think one of the things that we certainly have seen from the stories that get submitted, from the prayer requests that get submitted, is that there's stigma. I mean, we receive prayer requests where it's don't help my son fight this disease, but help him become a better person. And I think one of the things that we need to start with, we had a pastor who told their story in one of our magazines that basically he was stealing from the church because he'd become addicted to pain pills, and tells this very redemptive story of how the church actually embraced him during that time. Even though he was stealing from them, even though he was committing criminal acts against the church. And he said that addiction is really not about good and bad people, but it's about people who are suffering, who need to be made whole. And when we approach people in that way, and we remove, you talk about brain scans, it's a disease. There's physical evidence that you can see, but I think when we start with addiction, many times we say, well, what's their moral failing? And if we as a group start with, okay, they have an illness that, yes, there are things that illness leads people to do that are not good, but it is an illness, but it's not about good and bad. And then I would leave it to Brad and Jan to just to tell you how to do the next steps, because that's outside my pay grade.
Thanks for pointing that out, John.
Well, that's exactly right, John. And again, we have limited time, but I would fall back on truth and love. And you approach the person in truth and love. And if you do that, they will respond, I believe. And so, but know the facts, know the truth, but then approach them, as John's saying, not in a spirit of condemnation or judgment, but in a spirit of love. And I think you'll get a good response.
All right. Well, we are at 9 o'clock, and can't thank Brad, Jan, John enough for your time, your wisdom, that very important message. I think it's crucial that we have increased awareness around this topic and topics around mental health. So if it's okay with everybody, we're just going to close us in prayer. And dear Lord, we just thank you for the opportunity to gather during this crisis like this, Lord, to talk about such an important and relevant topic around mental health, and particularly addiction and the amount of people that are affected by that. Lord, I just pray for all of us that we could have generous hearts and abilities to recognize when people are suffering and hurting, and give us the abilities to reach out and help and comfort and provide hope and provide what we can, Lord, through you to help people get on that path. Lord, I pray for a continued lifting of the stigma of addiction. Lord, it seems like there is some progress, but there's much to go there. And Lord, that we could have more hearts of compassion rather than contempt or scorn around people that suffer from this terrible illness. And Lord, that we would just have stories that could come out of a culture that understands more the effects of addiction, Lord. And they could just be stories of redemption and just great hope, because the recovery stories just increased, Lord, and the rates of addiction would go down. So Lord, I just ask that you would bless everyone on this call that took the time to join in, and fill us with your spirit, Lord. We pray all this in the name of Jesus.
Amen. Thank you, Greg. Again, thanks to Brad, John, and Jan. Thanks to this community for joining in. Next week, we're going to talk about another group that's really powerfully impacted by this situation. Some call them quarantines, but the impact of COVID and isolation on youth in particular. Again, look forward to our catalog of videos we're going to release the last few weeks today. So look for that. some great conversations. But again, and I would say I would encourage you in this season, look up Guideposts. Faith, hope, and prayer is probably what we all need more of right now, and some good news. So again, thank you all for an outstanding conversation, incredibly powerful, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.
Thank you,
God bless.
everybody.